My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So we're recording this on February 5th, 2022.
So, once again, we had no good ideas about banter. So we will be once again doing Foreign Policy's What in the World quiz, published on February 4th and covers the previous 7 days. Neither of us has seen the quiz, so let's see how it goes.
Yep, so third time's the charm. So our record for the previous episodes is failing grades still. So we're going to just stick with the 5-question format, I think. So the first 5 questions of this week's quiz, and hopefully we can get a passing grade this time. All right, so question number 1. Which of the following countries did not send an official government delegation to the Beijing Winter Olympics, which began this week? Russia, Japan, Argentina, or Qatar?
Qatar?
Yeah, I want to go with that because Biden met with Qatar around the natural gas shipments to Europe. But at the same time, China's such a huge customer for that natural gas. So I'm gonna say Japan, even though I don't think
No, it was Japan. I just wasn't sure about that. I know Argentina because we talked about that. But Japan has tried to maintain close economic relations. So it would have made sense for Japan to go. But
yeah, exactly. And they must have been pretty late on that, too, because they definitely weren't part of the, UK and Canada? Yeah. The ones that early.
They may not have made it official. Mm-hmm. I think India also didn't. I remember reading about that. Okay. So I'll read the question, you read the answers. Which Gulf leader visited the U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House on Monday? You can just say, really, the country, because these names are hard.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so the choices are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE. Since we were just talking about this, Qatar would be my guess.
Yeah, but if we're wrong, then I'm going to say
it's going to be a little sad.
But it was Qatar. Good for us.
All right, so question 3. Leaders of African Union member states will gather for a summit at the organization's headquarters this weekend. Where is it located? Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, or Madagascar?
I'm going to go with Ghana.
Yeah, that's a good guess. Just be different. I'll go with Nigeria.
Okay. We are both wrong. It's Ethiopia.
Oh, man. Okay.
I admit, Africa is not always my strongest suit.
Mine either. Question 4.
Which organization accused Israel of the international crime of apartheid on Tuesday, drawing immediate pushback from the Israeli government? Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Global Rights, Freedom House.
Yes, I missed this one too. I'm going to say Human Rights Watch.
I feel like I read this story or heard about it. So I'm going to go with Amnesty International. And I was right.
Oh, man. All right, so I think we've each gotten 2 right. I think we're already guaranteed a failing grade, but...
But I think we can combine it.
Oh, we can combine it?
I feel like we should.
Okay. All right, so we need to get this next one right. All right, question 5. How many more U.S. troops did Biden pledge to send to Europe this week as Russia continues to threaten Ukraine? 35, 10,000, 250, or 2,000? I'm going to say 2,000.
Yeah, but there's a part of me that I feel like I heard 10,000. It was 2,000, which makes sense. I don't know why I heard 10,000 in my head.
Yeah, I swear 3,000 was thrown out, so I was surprised to see 2,000. I guess that has fluctuated a bit, but they're saying how many more troops, because I think maybe they're moving 3,000, positioning them from Germany to Poland and I can't remember, Romania, I think.
I feel like we had a general idea of most of these.
Yeah. Yeah, so we declare victory, so we finally passed.
Victory for this week.
Perfect.
High five. High five. So getting down to the serious stuff. On today's episode, we will be covering the main news from January 22nd through February 5th. We begin with the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine crisis and what the most viable exit strategy is for Putin's short, full-scale war. Sorry, I obviously just read that part the first time. So Ryan is like going through here and editing as I'm trying to talk. Then on to the... This is going to be a theme, so I probably will not even manage to delete all these out. Then on to the Winter Olympics in Beijing. The COVID pandemic is still wreaking havoc on the games, and much of the attention, interestingly, has been on the diplomatic front. The national leaders who have used this as an opportunity to get face-to-face meetings with Xi are maybe more important than what we've heard about before, which are the countries who have diplomatic boycotts. During both of these topics, we will be also discussing the China-Russia relations, their goal for a new world order, and whether there's any real substance to their actions so far. All right, so our first topic, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And Ryan is going to give us the main developments, the main topics.
Okay, yeah. So obviously this has been ratcheting up over the last couple of weeks since our last episodes. A lot of different takes, a lot of new developments. So just summarizing kind of what's happened over those past couple of weeks. Probably the main issues would be the increased diplomatic push on the U.S. side, particularly, with the UN meeting this past Monday. That was a meeting requested by the United States and its fellow members of the Permanent Security Council, so the UK and France. It was really kind of a public airing of the grievances and, making the case for why this is threatening behavior. Of course, you saw unified pushback from both Russia and China, the other two permanent members. But it was part of a concerted effort that I think the U.S. and the Biden administration has done a good job on. Again, that balance between diplomacy, where they continuously are meeting with Russian officials, and also, not backing down. So we talked about during the quiz, the movement of additional troops from Germany to some of the eastern NATO countries to forward positions. You've also seen quite a bit within the news, the media showing exposure of various plots and false flag operations that the Russians are allegedly planning, including a planned coup attempt, which I think we mentioned last week, but it seems like there's a steady stream of this. And whether this is part of kind of psyops against the Russians or legitimate, hacking operations and intelligence operations that have uncovered these plans. Seems encouraging in terms of, if Putin, again, being an ex-KGB guy, if his intention is not kind of full frontal assault, but rather subversion, it seems like it's a good sign that we're uncovering these plans. But at the same time, all of this has had a detrimental impact, obviously, on the stability within the Ukraine. So the President Zelensky actually had a bit of a split with the West and NATO, expressing kind of annoyance and the fact that felt that the West was drumming up the threat. Obviously, they've been in a civil war situation. But, the reality is there's 130,000 Russian troops that have surrounded the country on three different sides. So you can appreciate that Zelensky is trying to make the best of a difficult situation and keep both the populace and the economy from panicking. But at the same time, obviously, this isn't the same as the low-grade civil war that's been happening in the Donbass region since 2014. So those are the main developments. I think the areas we wanted to talk a little bit more in detail included kind of our first aspect of the China-Russian relationship and the Ukraine.
So something I've been wondering about, and we have talked about for a little bit, is what is Putin's exit strategy? Because I think it matters less what Putin hoped to accomplish this in the beginning. Because if he hoped to destabilize, if that was his goal, to destabilize the Ukrainian government, It's obviously not something he's going to get. But he needs to find a way to go home with a victory. And so I'm curious, and we've kind of been talking about what we think Putin will consider a viable exit strategy. Because at this point, he's talking to a domestic audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, that it is, how he's perceived domestically. That's still important, although, I think he has a pretty solid control on the opposition and the media within the country and the general apathy that exists among most Russian citizens at this point, just given how beaten down they've been over the last 15 years. But in terms of, where he's kind of backed in a corner. I think the New York Times opinion piece by Lulia Latininia on January 28, she's a foreign correspondent that's covered Putin for a number of decades. And, makes the case that he's really backed in a corner at this point. And it's really a function of the fact that there was a robust response by the U.S., by the NATO, that I think wasn't fully anticipated by Putin. She made the case, which I find hard to believe, but it's been made by many analysts, that Russia and potentially China have been emboldened by the perceived weakness from the U.S. Afghan withdrawal and saw that as an opportunity to test the resolve, and not expecting, this assertiveness that I think the Biden administration has been able to put forward. And there's this history of backing down for Putin when actually faced with a real opponent and real conflict. She cites two examples. One was in 2018 when the U.S. took out a number of Russian mercenaries in Syria, and essentially Russia just buried it. Same with a Turkish strike on Russia, again in Syria. Most recently, we talked about last time the intervention in Kazakhstan, where Russia sent in troops basically to put down a domestic uprising. But they were quickly removed after the Chinese foreign minister called. And we'll get into this in the Chinese relation. But obviously, China has substantial economic interests, and they were not informed beforehand about Russian troops coming into Kazakhstan.
I want to make a comment that those are all very different cases in coming back to the domestic public, right? So this is a situation where you have military troops on the border for weeks, and you would think that his domestic audience would want something for that, right? It's one thing to ignore a strike on your troops in Syria. It's a very different thing to put all these troops on the border and then just go home.
Yeah, I mean, he has to come away with something, and what that something looks like, I think, is where we've kind of discussed. So, I mean, I think one of the options, and probably the least likely, is, just accepting what the U.S. and NATO have offered, because they have put on greater transparency, some limitations to military exercises, particularly in the Eastern NATO countries, and then declare victory, saying, well, we forced them to push towards these particular accords, and they've backed down. The Russian media, I think, can frame it any way they want. And given, the high commodity prices and should be relative strength of the Russian economy coming out of it, maybe it's forgiven. I mean, I don't know. The second one that we've talked about, and this we can discuss, is kind of a relatively minor incursion to have formal Russian troops within the Donbass region and the Crimea, and then to declare them independent from the Ukraine, and then declare victory and go home. I know you're a fan kind of that exit.
Yeah. I was just thinking too, and again, we'll talk about it more, but mostly I think he has a domestic audience, but to the extent he has an international audience, he does not want Russia to look weak. And if he wants stuff out of China and Xi, the last thing he needs to look like is that he had to, I don't know what the saying is. It's like he's, and that he walks away with nothing of substance. I think he also has to send a message. He's bringing something for China. annoying Europe. I mean, I think China's just happy with Russia occupying Europe and being a pain. But I think...
Yeah, I guess, but it works against the whole NATO thing, because NATO definitely under that scenario is fully re-strengthened, re-justified. You potentially have new members in the form of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So in China's interest, in terms of weakening these alliances that the U.S. has constructed, that kind of works against them, I would say, any sort of antagonistic. Because China wants stability more than this disruption of...
Right.
Or forced disruption through kind of military conflict.
Right. But, I mean, we'll talk about this more, but, I mean, NATO doesn't threaten China, really. And it keeps the U.S. having to be involved in Europe instead of being able to put his full attention on China. There are some good outcomes there. And in China, trying to build this whole new world order, it'd be nice for them to have a strong Russia or perception. I mean, a lot of this, too, is sort of about perceptions.
I just don't see... I mean, this certainly would weaken Russia considerably, because with any sort of incursion, the full impact of the economic sanctions, including the severe American technology sanctions and blockades, which could turn around and impact China if they're not willing to take that hit and take additional sanctions from the U.S. and Europe. So in the long term, I don't know. I know we talk about kind of Western discipline over the long term, that this is only, maybe a 2-year impact, and then Russia can easily ride through it if commodity prices stay high, in which case not that much damage done and worth the risk.
I'm so glad we brought up sanctions, because that's what I spent most of my time researching after a conversation we had about it. I mean, I do not have confidence at all that we can have a meaningful impact on Russia with economic sanctions. It's really nothing we're doing is greater than what we did in 2014. That also coincided with a plummet in oil prices, energy prices. And that actually, so Russia went into a deep recession, but it had little to do with the sanctions. And it certainly did not change Russia's behavior at all. Targeting the oligarchs, which people always think like, oh, that's how you'll get to challenge Putin. But we'll put a link to this article, but it was in the New York Times. The author was saying, Mr. Putin has learned how to keep Russia's all-important political and business elites who keep him in power, loyal even under sanctions. Political insiders or oligarchs who lost their flats and foreign investments after 2014, for example, may have been granted a construction or energy contract at home as recompensation. So he was saying this actually strengthens regime coherence, said, of sanctions targeting the elite. So I knew that this had been tried before in 2014. I couldn't remember exactly. And so I think we're just we're doing all the things we did in 2014 that had no effect, no long-term effect. And also, you have to think about sanctions also hurt the sanctioning economy. So while it did hurt the Russian economy in a way that totally did not destabilize Putin, it also had an effect on the EU countries participating in those sanctions. So that also makes it really hard to keep sanctions long-term.
Yeah, no, and I fully agree. I mean, we talked about in previous episodes any sort of financial means of kind of constraining them, given the twin impacts of their foreign reserves and then the commodity prices being very high at this time. They're able to easily weather. I mean, he's built a system that is meant to weather kind of these sanctions and impacts, which I think I wanted to talk about the third possible scenario. And that's just creating a continuous crisis where the troops are indefinitely in place and are meant to just wear away and grind away the resolve of NATO and the EU down to the point that it also, because you'd have all the destabilizing impacts on the Ukraine and the hopes that eventually that would be so unpopular within the country that would weaken the current regime, make that coup attempt more possible. And I think you definitely can break German resolve because they're the weakest link within this.
Well, tell me how long you think that he could actually do that. I mean, he can't do it indefinitely.
Yeah, why not? He's just repositioned troops, elsewhere. I mean, it has some cost, but with commodity prices, with oil price being $100 a barrel, he can easily afford to keep 100,000 troops stationed permanently in that area.
What is the domestic reaction to that?
Nothing. It has no impact domestically. They aren't sending body bags home, and they'll report it or downplay it on the state media.
Okay, well, I didn't do research into that possibility. I mean, I guess. I just think 100,000 on the border is going to be a lot to maintain indefinitely. I don't see it being possible.
It's definitely... Well, the idea is that you're destabilizing enough. I think you keep gas imports restricted going to the Ukraine, so you're damaging the economy. Because of the threat of war constantly overhanging the Ukraine, it prevents further capital investment. It scares away kind of all their equity and financing markets. It just overall wears down the Ukrainian economy to the point where after a year, 2 years, I mean, maybe he's pushing for even the duration until the next election in 2024, where where Zelensky is extremely unpopular at that point. And then you continue to push for reinstating the Minsk Accords, where the Donbass region is reintegrated. So you almost have like a reset to what his original intent was.
I don't see that at all, because having those troops on your border has only made them more anti-Russian, right? There's no way.
Yeah, but it's time. It's the wearing down. They've already been in a low-grade civil war with Russians on their border. They've had Russians on their border for 7 years.
Right.
They've had 50,000 Russian troops on their border. I mean, this is just a continuation of grinding down.
Consolidated anti-Russian feeling amongst Ukraine. The more you have a foreign power on your border, you are going to hate that foreign power with troops there.
Yeah, but I think
they're not going to blame the economy on their president and try to get somebody in there who's more favorable to Russia when they all hate Russia.
Again, it's trying to think what other ways without going to war, because I think we can agree that that's not in Putin's interest to go to war. That what are the other options out there? And this is more of if regime change is kind of the goal, which ultimately it has to be, they want control of the Ukraine centrally.
But I'm saying that was his original goal, but now he has to take a win. But
maybe he doesn't want to back away from that. He just wants to take this alternative approach of creating chaos and instability, which Russia does like to do.
I guess my point is he can't accomplish his goal. Having troops on the border is not going to accomplish his goal.
Maybe if you give it enough time, maybe it does.
I don't see that. I don't see him wanting to, I mean, if he does, then the sanctions become longer term. I mean, I think even China could push back a little bit at that time. I don't see that scenario happening at all.
So the other aspect is the U.S. has been taking a pretty proactive approach, is trying to address the fundamental weakness of the EU energy security. And this has really been driven since the beginning of the fall. You've seen a tremendous rise in European gas prices, driven by factors that we talked about in the previous episodes. So the U.S. has been real active on this front. There's a really good article in the New York Times that summarized it from the LNG export side. And as I think we've mentioned, the market's extremely tight. It's not like they can source enough gas in order to make up for a potential shortfall that Russia provides. Because again, Russia provides about 40% of natural gas to European consumers. But what in this article makes a good point of, the U.S. LNG capacity has grown considerably over the last 6 years. And it has been in a position to increase those shipments over the past couple of months. And in fact, the shipments to Europe in the fourth quarter of 2021 were up more than 40% from a year earlier, according to the IEA. And, that's partially been enabled by the fact that the winter in Asia has been relatively warm. So that's allowed for shipments to be redirected, both from the US and to a lesser extent, Qatar, in order to make up some of that gap that's existed within the market.
I thought it was interesting here, the deal with Azerbaijan. Am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. No one should make me have to pronounce names, but they're discussing a deal with Europe to alleviate some of the supply were it to be cut off by Russia. But they made some points that we've been making before too. They can have some emergency supplies, but they don't have a lot of extra, right? There's not a lot of extra in the system this year to be sending Europe. To really replace Russia or give diversification for Russia, it would involve having to make long-term contracts. Because as we said, that's what you need to, if you're going to increase your oil, your natural gas production, then you need, contracts to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to, these are, especially with LNG, given the facility investment, these are long-term, 10, 20-year payouts. So you need long-term customers and contracts in order to back it. That's why I thought it was kind of interesting that the U.S., has been taking this aggressive approach, visited with Qatar, obviously had their head of state visit the White House. And their position has been, hey, we have all these long-term contracts with Asia, and we'd really prefer, if there's any sort of diversion request, that it comes directly from the United States to those buyers. So sure enough, over the last couple of days, it's been reported that the U.S. is approaching Japan, South Korea, and India, and even had limited approaches to China, which is pretty surprising given, what we'll talk about in the growing alliance between Russia and China. But I thought there was a good point mentioned in one of these articles from one of the analysts at BCS Global Markets saying, in reality, you would have to divert half of the LNG that Asia consumes in order to replace everything that Gazprom, so the Russian natural gas company. And, essentially what would that mean? That would mean massive energy shortages all across Asia. And that's something we've discussed as well.
Confirmation of what I pointed out a lot. Azerbaijan would be a deal just with Europe. It wouldn't go through the United States. Some potential for pipeline, or maybe they already have something there. I don't know. But again, I think it's more like, here we have natural gas that we've been wanting to invest our infrastructure, but that's their source of economic wealth. And I can't remember, because I read about it quite a while ago, if they have had that much success in getting the infrastructure, because that's a real source of wealth for them. But I don't know how much they've been able to develop it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, it's always that lack of demand. And obviously with higher prices, it's an open question whether, it could be permanently higher prices. And we talked about that a little last week, given the energy transition, maybe kind of the shortfall investment in certain areas may lead to higher natural gas prices in the next 5 to 10 years. But yeah, Nigeria was the same way. Nigeria is the biggest source of flared and vented gas because it was, it's a waste product. There's no way to, the expense of putting in an LNG terminal didn't justify the investment. So there's a lot of different gas sources, obviously associated with all the big oil fields out there, that could be commercialized and increase the supply of natural gas. But this is a problem or a solution that's, 5-10 years away. Doesn't help Europe this winter.
Right. So all of these things. And then on the other side, I was looking at, there, as much as the EU needs to diversify natural gas from Russia, obviously Russia needs to not be dependent on one supplier too. And so I was reading stuff about what was happening between Russia and China, because China has been very interested in that. And one thing it pointed out that in terms of crude oil, China is actually the country as the biggest importer. I have some pretty graphs here. So they have some infrastructure pipelines in place to help transport that. It's a much smaller part of natural gas, but there are several initiatives that have started or finishing up. So some of these you mentioned to me. You have the gas pipeline called the Power of
Siberia.
Yeah, Siberia, which directly connects to China. It's supposed to reach its full capacity by 2025. And so that will be a substantial gas supply. I don't know how to compare these units. 1.3 TCF.
Yeah, it's trillion cubic feet. So yeah, it's definitely between, what was the name again?
Power of Siberia.
Yeah, so they had the first Power of Siberia, and then they're planning a second one, which will actually bring gas from a field that's closer positioned to Europe, to China. And I think you're directly right. I mean, it's in China's interest because the majority of their exports go through South China Sea, through the Middle East, which is not necessarily protected waters for them in the case of any sort of military conflict with the U.S. So having those over land routes, extremely valuable to their security.
Right, and it's one of the reasons why Chinese Navy is so involved in those waters. The other one that they just approved a feasibility study from Gazprom would go to China via Mongolia, and it's called the Soyuz. Anyway, some Russian name that I'm just terrible. This sounds really Russian, and that actually will have a higher export capacity up to 1.7
TCF.
Yeah, TCF.
Yeah, and they've also been interested. There's kind of an Arctic policy element. Obviously, Russia has been kind of a leader. As we've had global warming, the melting of the ice caps, more of the Arctic has become exposed. So Russia's been extremely aggressive there, particularly around oil and gas exploration. China has declared itself a near-Arctic country and that it has a strategic interest, which kind of rubs Russia a little bit the wrong way, but at the same time, any sort of investment in the Arctic is extremely capital intensive. So there's definitely interest in having kind of a joint Russian-Chinese investment, again, to bring more natural gas supplies.
Yeah. The Arctic is fascinating, what's going on there. Maybe we should read it or look at it. I mean, just because you have Canada being really contentious with the United States, a lot of people think that maybe the next source of conflict could come from the Arctic, but I honestly don't know enough about it. I just find it really interesting. The other thing I thought was interesting about Russia being less dependent on Europe, they have a pipeline that came on 2020 that goes directly to Southern Europe. It's the Turk Stream. Turk Stream 2 would extend further onshore to deliver natural gas to Hungary, Serbia, and Bulgaria. Those seem significant as well.
Yeah, I mean, they've definitely kind of diversified across multiple areas, and there's, unique conflicts around all of those pipelines when they were put in and planned and designed. So yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know enough about kind of each one, but each of them has some sort of geopolitical story behind it.
Yeah, and so right now, of course, you have these date from 2020, according to EIA statistics. But you have German natural gas exports. 72% are going to OECD European countries, Turkey and Hungary and stuff. But then you have other parts of Europe, the non-OECD parts of Europe, which is like Belarus and Kazakhstan. That takes up 17%. I think there's a lot of room, especially with greater infrastructure coming on for Russia. But in any sense, again, I kind of just wonder, some of these infrastructure projects are probably from 2014. And it's interesting, I almost think there have been more infrastructure projects on the Russian end to diversify its exports than EU end to be less dependent on those Russian exports.
Yeah, Europe's done a horrible job on diversification, and probably its biggest resource it had, nuclear power, it scuttled earlier following the Fukushima incident. So yeah, European policy around energy has been an absolute disaster. Totally agree.
Yeah, and I just guess I want to note, Russia has not been making that same mistake.
Well, they made the mistake of their economies built around commodities, and they haven't advanced it. They haven't done the things that China has done or less resource-rich countries have done. So it's fine. And you know what? Honestly, it'll work out okay through the energy transition period. So I think the next 10, 20 years for Russia are going to be okay. But after that, if they aren't using these resources, even to the extent that like the Middle Eastern countries are doing to invest in other parts of their economy, they're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yes, but that is the problem with resource countries. It was really interesting to me, and this was a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, because when Colombia became a major energy exporter, the OECD, which they'd just become a member of not that long ago, but was criticizing them time after time because they did not diversify their economy. And so it is challenging for these countries to diversify new industries to even pour themselves into. So to go on more directly, I guess, going more directly to China and Russia, and then other aspects of the Olympics. So diplomacy at the Olympics has gotten a lot of attention. There was first the summit between Xi and Putin. Interestingly, this was Xi's first time doing an in-person meeting with a world leader in the past 2 years. So somewhat of significance that he did it with Putin. And then these Latin American countries I'll talk about. So I think, a lot of people have been trying to think about, well, what does it mean for Russia and China to not have an alliance, but strategically ally themselves with each other? Are any of these actions significant or do they not matter? And I think that they matter. I think they both have incentives. I don't know how much they matter, but I think certainly you will see China willing to spend some money, some economic losses to help Russia, if it really feels like these are going to get Russia on its side and help it advance its challenge to the West. If China feels like they will get any more power out of it or ability to contest the so-called liberal order, then I think they see this as a good strategy for them.
I agree that there's obviously shared interest between the two, particularly around kind of an anti-U.S. approach and a desire to change the existing kind of post-war order. I guess they're approaching it from two different ways. I mean, China's approaching it from the historic wrongs of colonialism and the century of humiliation that they emphasize, and then Russia's approaching it, and when we say Russia, we mean Putin. Putin's approaching it from the tragedy of the loss of the Cold War. So both of them have an interest in a different world order, and I think that's where their shared value system comes from. But that being said, these are informal ties. So these are not the legally binding security guarantees that exist for nations like NATO that the U.S. has, or even the U.S.'s alliances in the Indo-Pacific. So these are about convenience and about the optics of it, because both countries are extremely sensitive around their own strategic autonomy. And they don't want to enter into these sort of formal agreements. I mean, China sure as hell doesn't want to be tied or pulled into a conflict with the Ukraine. China's been working on building its own relationship, its own investments within the Ukraine. So they definitely don't see eye to eye on that. And then there's still, there's mutual mistrust at the intelligence and the Secret Service level. And that really will prevent kind of deeper cooperations on sensitive issues like information warfare against common adversaries. That being said, they have held pretty massive military exercises together, which is significant. It is significant.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that. And they share a lot of military technology.
They do share technology, but again, Russia's complained a lot that the Chinese have stolen a significant amount. And I would say that as China advances in its sophistication, they're not going to need to buy as much or share as much technology with Russia. And it's actually not in their strategic interest, because I don't think there's a deep felt trust. Because if we go back historically, they've had a number of border-related issues. There's quite a bit of xenophobia on both sides. There's quite a bit of racism on the Russian side. So I don't think there's a deep felt at the civil society level between the two countries, that some of it is just this alliance of convenience and, hey, you hate the U.S.? Well, I hate the U.S. too. You want
that can be very powerful, though.
That is powerful. I mean, we were allied with Stalin during World War II, so it could be a motivating factor.
I was listening to this podcast just today, and I'll have to find out the name of the expert who's speaking, and he was talking about both the history and the relationship now. But I found it kind of interesting, some of the personal background, that Xi's father, who is like one of Chow En-Lai's, like second hand to him, and he was in charge of the diplomats to the Soviet Union. And then just the very, very favorable interactions that they had before, things diverged so much between the two countries.
So his family was kind of involved in that original golden age, like in the 1950s, after the Communist Party took over in China. And the Soviet Union was like, together there as communist brothers helping each other out.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I found that really interesting. I mean, I don't know how much the personal, no one ever knows how much, but actually someone who thinks a lot about personal connections influencing things. I mean, I think there's some element of that.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think that's overplayed a little bit, that it's more than just personal relationships.
But I also of course it has to be. Yeah. But I also want to push back a little bit, because just saying, oh, well, they don't have a military alliance. But especially China wouldn't even see that as the most important thing. To say that, oh, there's not a military alliance, but they are allied on these other issues.
Yeah, but not legally. Nobody's legally bound to anything for...
But as long as they're acting, and I mean, I don't know how much it matters that there's a legal bond to it or not.
Yeah, but how strong is that in terms of...
Well, if their actions are strong, it's going to be strong.
Yeah, their actions are talk. That's why I don't see the long range durability, especially from China's point. Because I think the other thing to mention is that, when you compare the economies between the two, I mean, China dwarfs Russia.
Right.
And the percentage of trade that Russia makes up of Chinese economy is like less than 1%, while for the Russian economy, China's like 15, 16%. So it's a huge disparity between the two.
China's now the number one exporter to Russia.
Right.
Number one trading partner, which is a big shift from Europe. I'm not sure what year that happened. No, some other things that I thought, though, was interesting. The pipelines and stuff are more than just talk. I mean, one of them is already open, and the other one should be completed.
Yeah, but I don't know how much to read it. I mean, I will say, to your point, that these projects from outside analysts, none of them are economic. Russia's losing money to China. But again, I'm like, I get what China's getting out of this. But if Russia's losing money, if it's getting worse pricing than Europe, besides the long-term diversification, I don't know. I mean, I guess, in that sense, it is political, because you're not doing it for economic reasons. This is a disaster for Russia.
So this is what I think is really notable about maybe just what it says about international relations in theory. Because, again, we'll go back to Mersheimer and realism, and every country just wants power, and fine power, hard power, military power. And yet we've seen with Germany how it will overlook security externalities, which you should be very sensitive to, have this really notable critical dependence on Russian oil because of money. On the other hand, I don't think Putin is motivated very much by that. Like, he's not going to claim that he's brought economic success to Russia. So what he's going for, I totally think Russia is playing more of a Mersheimer game, but maybe also more a constructivist game. For Russia, it's important to just be said, I'm a power that has influence, right? Yeah. And so that's why he could make those deals.
Because you're making a big deal with China, the new big dog on the block, or a major power, a major player.
And China acknowledging you as a major player, which they've done.
Having the big state-level meetings, the things like the Olympics,
So the language, and I can't find the article, I was just looking through them, that China has been using, and in that summit, was that the U.S. is one of the key players, but was not defining its relationship vis-a-vis the U.S. anymore. which I think is pretty significant. And that was done in the context with Russia.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I think for Putin, who his legacy in the end is just, we're still a major power, right?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. That's a huge motivating. I mean, he misses the age of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was the other major superpower, had major events on everything. I mean, that explains Syria, too. I mean, their intervention there saying, hey, we're a major power. We can intervene in the Middle East and have an influence there. I could see how that
And China gets an ally in trying to advance its authoritarian world order system. So I also, basically one of these articles was just making the same point that I've also made, in that in being able to say, okay, the current liberal order is imposing upon you, these other countries, to have to meet their standards of human rights, their beliefs, and their values. And we want to promote a world order where you have the right to decide your values, how you treat people, if you want to treat them collectivist instead of as individuals, and act in the world, right? To still have all these economic ties, but we're not going to burden you with these extra regulations. And having Russia join them makes it I think it helps enhance China doing so.
Yeah, I don't know about enhance. I mean, they're both kind of pariahs to a certain extent.
To call China pariah, this is also something I want to, because
who are their allies? They're allies with each other, North Korea and Iran. These are not.
But China's making so much money. So everybody is like, so this is what
everybody wants to balance against China. Nobody wants to be allies with China.
Okay, but, first, I would say that's only the West. I'll give you a lot of examples.
I'd say all of Southeast Asia wants to balance against China. But they want good relationships with China, but they want good relationships with the U.S., and they want the U.S. to be involved in the region.
They don't like the U.S. saying, like, oh, us versus China. They don't like things like, oh, American competitiveness bill against China. They don't like that. They don't like any language that pits the U.S. against China.
Yeah, but if that's what it takes for the U.S. to stay involved in the region, I think that's a price they're more than willing to pay.
I don't know about that.
They definitely don't want Chinese hegemony in Asia. I can tell you that for sure.
If they had to choose between the U.S. economically and China economically, they would have to choose China.
Well, I don't think they're being forced to choose that. We're not framing it that way.
They do not
cut off all economic. That's unrealistic, and nobody's framing it that way.
So how much of a pariah is China when they keep increasing the amount of trade they do with the rest of the world? Their trade keeps increasing with all these nations. You don't do that with pariahs.
Yeah, I mean, one's the economic consideration, another is around security and value systems.
You are acting with that economics is
I'm not
completely
saying pariah
separate.
in the sense of like Iran or North Korea, but in terms of desirability of the system itself and having them as a hegemon. Nobody desires that in that region. Nobody would see any benefit from that.
Well, Myanmar now, became authoritarian.
Again, pariah nations that.
But what I'm saying is you're acting like power is separate from economics. And
it's one aspect of power.
Is a huge aspect of power.
It's one aspect of power.
It's a really important one.
Well, look, Russia's ridden a long way just on having military power to some extent.
But Russia, that's all Russia really has. China is definitely playing a game that focuses more on economics as power.
Yeah, so going back to the economic aspect in the Ukraine, I don't see China willing to take a huge economic impact on behalf of Russia, because that's one of the things underpinning the ineffectiveness of like the SWIFT financial networks, so banning that, is the fact that you have this alternative that Russia and China have set up. But would China actually be willing, given its relative weakness economically with the things that we talked about, the slowdown, the real estate market, all the supply chain issues, the lingering effects of COVID? I don't see them willingly going to bat for Russia in any meaningful way if it means cutting off 1 or 2% of GDP from them.
Well, so I disagree, because depending on how it is, if it's trying to get their new system off the ground, they will definitely choose that strategically to go in depth.
I don't think if it economically hurts them in any way, no, they won't.
I think they will. And I think that it looks like, oh, Russia then has no choice to do anything against Europe because of the financial stuff, I think China will help them.
I think they'll help them around the margins, but it won't make a substantial impact if it costs them.
I think it's in China's strategic interest, and they will take a loss.
We'll say again, they don't have any sort of formal alliances, so there's no legal framework for this. This all depends on supposition and Putin and Xi's relationship, which maybe that's enough.
I don't see what the point of, like, how it's most powerful. And we can say, oh, well, it doesn't mean anything just because they don't have a formal alliance about it.
Yeah, it shows the lack of commitment. These are fair weather friends. Because in terms of economic value, guess who's a lot bigger? The U.S. and the European Union. And having good relationships with that's far more important to the growth of Chinese power than Russia.
Right. We don't talk enough about, we define this whole world from the U.S. and Europe-centric view, but China's made a lot of inroads in Africa, which admittedly has less strategic interest to us, but they're making a lot of inroads in Latin America, and that does have strategic interest to us. And so
Agree.
The second really notable thing that happened in the Olympics that I was just reading about, really, Argentina's president and Ecuador's president both had these meetings, high-level meetings with Xi. But as people do, go to China for money. But Argentina was there to sign up for the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's the largest Latin American country to do so. And what's really interesting here is the context of that, of the fact that Argentina is in the process of restructuring $44.5 billion of debt with the IMF. So the Argentinian president has made it definitely a big deal in this with IMF that they will not take the type of restructuring loan that Argentina did in the early 90s, maybe.
Now, is this like they've defaulted on their debt with the IMF and they're negotiating with the IMF on how to remedy that?
Right. At the same time,
has China offered to be one of the debt providers to remedy that?
Not at this stage.
Okay.
But obviously, Argentina is trying to establish this relationship.
Right, yeah.
So basically, yeah. So they couldn't make their interest payments. Argentina couldn't make their interest payments, right?
Defunded, yeah.
So the president there had made it clear that he was critical of the original IMF bailout, which these were very unpopular, saying it financed capital flight and should have never been granted, and it would never accept a new agreement that would involve spending cuts. So the deal has something to do with like agreeing to levels of national debt or something I can't exactly remember, but that it was notably different. So the deal has been outlined, but neither party is signed to it. And so people are trying to read into the meaning, well, was this a good idea? Is this going to make the IMF less willing to do the loan? Or is he trying to encourage the IMF to, do the loan to keep Argentina in the West instead of relying completely on China? I mean, I just think that there's a lot of interesting dynamics. And then, like Latin America in general, they're no longer, so much of the infrastructure money and interest from the West has just completely dried up in Latin America. But they still have all these challenges. So by being part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which kind of challenges me geographically, they want...
right? Belt and Road to where? Yeah, that's...
But obviously they want infrastructure. They want in on this, being part of a larger infrastructure. And just, so part of when I was reading all this with Russia too, is sort of China's taking all these other countries, which have been allies of the West, and moving it closer to their side of the board.
Yeah, not strategically important allies, but typically spheres of influence for the U.S. in particular. Right. I mean, it goes back to the Monroe Doctrine.
And these governments are leftist. I mean, most of Latin Americans are on leftist now. And so that also, again, helps China compete in its worldview, right? In this worldview. And so it wants as many countries there, and it has something to offer those countries as well.
Yeah, and I agree. And we probably should have a whole episode just focusing on kind of South America and Africa and kind of China's, influence there. Obviously, I think particularly South America, that's always been framed as the U.S.'s backyard. So the fact that it seems like we've taken zero strategic interest in there through the Trump administration, through the start of the Biden administration, it's pretty concerning.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm also interested in more, and I plan in the next year to be researching more about Chinese economic activities, both in terms of incentives and using some economic control, economic power in Latin America. And if you guys have any comments that you want to give us about any of this and whatever part of it that you're interested in, please do. Questions, we'd like to answer people's questions. We'd like as much engagement as possible. So visit us at our website, www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com, and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg, or you'll most likely actually find the tweets on mine, AR Kellogg, at AR Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email. So Nita at kellogglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for all the articles we discussed in this episode and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.